back to Elwood and go by the river. She did a phenomenal job.
Good. Well, that was her first time having
She
to mess
did,
with that.
and I was very impressed. She didn't look like the deer in headlights. Side note. But you're-
She's an old pro. That's just a new event.
Well, when Cole, the very first year, he kind of, Brian and Salida kind of, let Cole kind of take over.
Something and it breaks.
I kept trying to warn him, and
I'm looking to buy
first
one
day we,
like that. I'm
that
not,
morning
I
we
don't know
got
if I
there, he
really
looked
wanna get one or not, and I was like.
and I'm like, I tried to tell you, because it's all hands on deck. I think he thought it was just gonna be kind of calm in the beginning, but.
That's it,
It's all hands on deck and everything. So we're gonna wrap up, but
No,
I'm really looking forward to working with you.
I came up and
Way back, but
anyway.
getting sprayed up.
Okay.
Oh, I'm watching.
Oh, yeah. And it was perfect.
I'm,
The day before,
currently the assistant city.
oh, there you go. You have a great day.
The only thing is that we do have, Jerry has a slide. Yeah, we might actually just,
Hello, sir.
he only has one slide.
I was there at 7. You all right? Because I don't know. I had to open up the buildings and had to be there when they crowned the snow princesses. They were Princess Mom. Go on, gentlemen. Not much, all right? Good.
Oh, yeah, everything's here.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I have.
It's sort of like the little league baseball.
What's that?
Yeah.
That's great.
See, I got one.
Well, hopefully we beat Wisconsin.
They actually gave one to all these.
My coffee
Shit
shop.
over.
I did.
Yeah, okay.
I know, just, you know, well, cool them down.
I intentionally
Sorry you missed us.
I think,
stopped on my
I guess
way.
they were due for a
Instead
bad
of going
game.
out my way, I just stopped and made that moment.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay.
morning, school
Yeah, let me get you one.
Yeah.
Great, great, great.
I don't think you yeah, this would just sound or something.
City about West.
Oh, okay, I'm with the city engineer.
Very nice.
You have one I use it. I was gonna say, as soon as I saw.
Like bigger chicks.
No, I know. Well, it's funny, because I can work with that.
Yeah.
But I understand, because
The rural roads, I will say, were,
they were pretty bad.
They were.
But the other thing too was,
well, as I say, when I came through Frankton, the gas station and Harvest Market in Frankton, there was no power
believe it or
there.
not, I'm kind of on my own, at City Hall. It's closed right now.
Oh, are they?
Yeah, our line got shut down, we had a branch fell on one of our, so we had to find a part that's gonna take 4 to 6 hours, and they just called it at 10 o'clock. Yeah, the power went off at 7.
Wow.
At 10 they canceled.
No, you just look at this and
So
then.
that doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, it's justified, you have to, it kinda looks kinda stupid, though, we all agree we're not in.
Yeah.
the power bill.
So we don't have a
In fact, I thought,
It happens.
I was searching
It does.
frantically for an email that maybe had some
You know,
content like the last.
in today's time.
I didn't find that either.
Yep.
We really
You make me feel better too.
Susan, you can find
There was a car on fire on the shoulder, so
Right.
it was stopped for a long time. I thought it would have been right, but then I got up there and yeah, it was blazing away.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
But,
Yeah, life can still go on, we can still keep doing good. So, yes. Exactly.
Really? Yeah, I seem to think that the remote or the TV power would work.
They said,
When you guys have these meetings, what's the best place to go? Do you park in the front, or do you just already on your own?
Pretty much on your own, there's plenty of, there's, you know, parking, that's a good thing.
I don't know, I think to the east of here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's fine. That's the nice thing about it.
I do not have one of those. Or just ride your bike.
Oh, there, now, why would
Well, it might be kinda hard to know.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Although if you're, you know, an elite cyclist.
I was there the other day.
Or you could park,
I couldn't
you know,
put
6 or 8 blocks away.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I'm done. Half hour, an hour, yeah.
We are on Friday tomorrow morning. So come to that session. I'm not too young for COVID.
I would do don't know about the rent.
The bike, I think part of it is I have a couple shortage.
Yeah.
So getting the right bike.
It's definitely, we have had our hands full getting the brick and mortar open, but it's definitely something we've talked about a little bit. I appreciate that. We'll definitely keep it in the. No.
Hi, how are you?
Because you're alright.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, I was at Falls Perk the other day and they fixed me a drink with extra flavoring in it.
Cute.
I don't know what I did to deserve that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if I feel bad.
Just you open?
You may not wanna know.
You're right.
I've been with the cheese, I've been there for 8 years.
If you take really good notes on the chapter, I'll just copy off of it.
It's a last one.
We're on the downtown grid. So our power doesn't go out between the police station and.
Photographic notes.
The reason I answered that on I think he's like, he's working so hard at these meetings, that by the time I get home, I can't remember anything here for you.
I'm gonna pass around the sign-in sheet again, just to make sure everyone got it, just in case you haven't had a chance to sign in.
Yeah, that was a great event this morning.
You did a fabulous job.
I heard, he spoke at the ribbon cutting that place, the ground breaking.
Fantastic, really. Corn was right where I thought it would be. I mean, I would tell you I was disappointed, but I just my expectations were a little too high. There was still better numbers.
You can do a series of, speaker series.
Two good beers. I haven't figured it out yet, but there's no way I average less than 250.
Wow, great.
Yeah, when you think about comprehensive plan. I thought it was a great preview. It wasn't designed that way.
Yeah.
I wish we had had that.
Beans are
Everything on Facebook Live, captured the broadcast that. I assume we didn't film it or anything.
I would say average numbers.
Early on, I invited
This time of year, not great. It's been a good year, yeah.
Always optimistic.
We, particularly in the service side of things, is
I think that's
we've
one
ever
of
done.
And then you do the same
Every
thing on
year.
Friday, right?
Yep.
Optimistic on what
I really feel, I'm so excited to be part of this conversation because it really feels like there's a shift that is already happening. And so we either need to jump on that and keep pushing it forward, or it's gonna swallow us. You know, the idea of population growth. Totally. Population growth is
They
going
handed
to
out a little bit of
happen.
relief, which will
How
help.
do we prepare ourselves for it?
And then it depends on how much else we're
We're
contract.
That's the decision.
Shove a little extra in your pocket and be a good job.
That's a good speaker.
That's a pretty effective speaker.
It was, in about 30 minutes.
Real heat history.
It was an effective.
Oh, up at 8th and John, maybe? Yeah, no, they were.
Yeah, you're on 32, yeah.
Yeah. No, they, I don't know when they closed.
You may.
Before we, well,
Just try to maintain a balance on that.
We're not 50-50. Every year really doesn't change. If you pick something up, you know, along the line, even if it was 10 years ago, the next year was, if it was corn, we probably put it beans the next year, and switch it. So we're not exactly even.
Okay.
Don't really change based on anything else.
Yeah, it's good. Okay. Okay. All right, that's probably the least you can do.
I had.
No, I keep it in First things first.
No, I think Walter Evans was the city manager.
No, you're good.
I was on the phone.
Yeah.
Had an
Oh,
appointment
wrong way.
in Richmond and one in Newcastle, was canceled, but then he got called from Newcastle. He's gonna go visit him. Used the opportunity,
Okay, how are you?
You guys decided on this one? Anybody need to sign in? Dirk? I'm not coming Friday.
Hey.
How are you
I'm
doing?
good, how are you, stranger?
Oh, I'm all right. Am I supposed to sign something?
I'll leave it on.
Something on right?
You're aware, we're recording.
Might be coming this way.
Did you have a good turnout expected?
Wake up this morning.
So you can tell them.
Meeting for this tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah, and we're not sure how many. We've gotten a lot of RSVPs, but we got a lot of people that want to come to that. This is what that converts to.
Okay. Now tell me, what you know, what you need in it.
Take the hardware around.
There's another laptop right there.
Right on.
We take trade-in, so we've got
really cold down there.
5 or 6 at any given time. And sizing, of course, is totally random, so it's a
We're
hard.
gonna go ahead and get started. So, first thing I wanna do is I wanna thank everybody for, coming out today. Weather's bad, but you're here, didn't dampen the spirits, I appreciate it. I also wanna thank everybody today for the fact that a whole lot of people sitting around this table have tried to get the word out. We've had publicity in the paper, we had a story in the paper. We've also had tons of allies, Rob Sparks, Ben Orcott, the commissioners, Tim from Pendleton, your staffs, like Beth's staff, city staffs. I appreciate that. I want to thank our staff and project team for this because they've done a ton of work to get us here. So we're all here today. We've got smiles on our face and some spirit. And I'm going to give you a couple thoughts after we introduce ourselves. I think it's important for Chris to know who's here today. So Pete, if you want to start.
Okay. Pete Tar, founder of Electric Jet Aircraft, and also work with Flagship Enterprise Center at the P3 building on Scattergood.
I'm Kirk Clabundi, I work at First Merchants Bank.
Rob Sparks, who is the Corporation for Economic Development for the county.
Kristen Fitzgerald, Community Wellness Coordinator with Purdue Extension.
Ben Orcutt, with Buckskin Bikes and Jackrabbit Coffee.
Dan Dykes, County Administrator. John Richwine, County Commissioner.
Tim McClintock, Pendleton Town Manager.
Courtney Pruitt, District Coordinator with Madison County Soil and Water Conservation.
Brandy Frazier, the Executive Director with Madison County Soil and Water.
Jerry Alexander, I'm just newly elected to the county council.
Dirk Webb with Madison County Chamber.
Walter Evans, Assistant City Engineer for the City of Anderson.
Marcy Fry with the City of Elwood and Chamber of Commerce.
Beth Thorpe, Community Hospital.
Terry.
I am, waiting on coffee.
You can stop by Jackrabbit and you can have it already.
Exactly. Left work earlier, just kind of driven by. I'm Terry Truitt, with Amherst University.
I'm Nancy Vaughn with United Way Madison County.
I'm Steve Thompson with the Realtor Association.
Neil Stevenson with the Madison County Council of Governments.
Ralph Holmes with the Madison County Council of Governments.
John Levine, Madison County Council of Governments.
Paul McBride, County Government.
Where's your green chair?
I would fall asleep.
Has everybody had a chance to sign in today?
Yes.
All right, just want to make sure that we have a recording of everybody that's here. Gonna give you a few thoughts and then we're gonna get to Chris, who's the main show. And so I want to make sure I thank staff. I really want to thank Paul because there's something he didn't know in regards to today. I'm going to give you a few thoughts of why we're here, and then I'll be quiet, I promise. So, why we're here, to challenge ourselves to take this journey together, first and foremost. Two, hi Aspen.
Hey.
Aspen, you want to introduce yourself?
Apologies for my tardiness. I'm Aspen Clemens. I'm with the Anderson Redevelopment Commission.
Welcome. To challenge ourselves to help make a better future. I think that's most important. And there's some good reasons for it. It's been 45 years since the oil embargo. And what we still hear in this community, and by community I mean Madison County, is we still talk about GM. There's too much concentration on the past and not enough concentration on the future. 45 years. That's not yesterday. It's 45 years. Some of us have been around long enough to live through the embargo, so we really understand. What we need to do today, challenge ourselves to learn, to educate, to engage in constructive thought, to share ideas and exchange conversation about our future. The next, to challenge how we grow. Perhaps not always bigger, and I'm going to tell you here, this is better, not bigger. 20 years ago, a friend of mine from NDOT, which Walter would know, Carter Keith, he knew my affinity for not only learning, but also challenging myself in regards to ideas, said pick this book up and read it. This directly has a lot to do with what Chris is going to talk about today. Sometimes we think that growth is only expansion, and I'm here to tell you today, and I hope Chris will challenge you today to think that it's not always that. That brings me to something else I read over 30 years ago in graduate school about the closing of the American mind. This is still relevant today, and I hope one of the things that we also understand is we need to open our mind, not close it. If you haven't read this, Hollowing Out the Middle, it's about the brain drain in the Midwest. A lot of you have read this, Caught in the Middle, a similar book. That goes back to 45 years from GM not being there. Last, a gift from staff about Anderson. When I grew up in Anderson, and many of us here who did, understood that we never settled for second best. We challenged for everything. We had a great school system, a great community to live in, and we never shied away from a challenge. Too many times today, we shy away from that challenge. Next on my list, the reason why I talked about that today with what came, Paul and I had a discussion last night in regards to technology. We think about it. If you think about the first mainframe that sent the man to space, there's more power today in a PC and in a phone almost than we had with that first mainframe. So change needs to be embraced, and we need to challenge ourselves to do that. Challenge ourselves to transformative sustainability, transformation, and that's key here. Transform who we are, where we want to go, and how we're going to get there. Next is to challenge ourselves and our neighbors to accept change. We have a history of change in this community. Accept the challenge. Understand that change takes time. 45 years since the oil embargo. It's time to actually rip that up a little bit, but we still need to do it. Last challenge, moving forward with a new vision. So I challenge you today to listen, learn, engage, and let us listen to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you all for coming out on this cold, icy morning to listen to me. I should say at the outset that I apologize. I've been fighting off a cold, so my voice is not, the usual wonderful, mellifluous tenor that I wish it was. I'll be drinking a lot of water. So since you all introduced yourself, I should probably say something about who I am. My name, as you heard, is Chris Zimmerman, and I work for this organization called Smart Growth America. First, me, I'm an economist by training, so now you know, and a recovering politician. So I always confess that at the beginning and think I've immediately lost all kinds of credibility. But I spent 18 years in local government in Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., in what's called the county government there, but unlike most of the rest of the country, Virginia doesn't have cities and counties. It's like one level of government, so cities mostly have the county powers, and counties mostly have the city powers, so it's the municipal government basically, in a place called Arlington, Virginia. I did that for 18 years, and then I came to Smart Growth America about 5 years ago, and had the opportunity to work on the issues that interested me as an elected official, you know, with places all around the country. Which basically come down to the intersection between land use and transportation. Because I found in my own work that most of our problems seemed in some way or another, at least a lot of our problems, to stem from the separation of transportation and land use planning. You know, obviously our traffic congestion, but less obviously all kinds of other things like health, because we became unwalkable, and that leads to more public health issues, like just the way our society interacts, the way our communities interact, when we were so separated by having to go in a car to do everything and living in kind of these little pods that we drive to and from. We don't have kind of the same sense of community, I think, as we do when we have places that relate to each other, where people know their neighbors and so on. And some of that, this isn't all the built environment, but a lot of it has to do with the built environment. So, and even fiscal issues, and as I said, I'm an economist, so you know, I often come to things from that standpoint. And a lot of the cost of running local government comes down to the things you have to do that turn out to be a lot harder to do when your transportation and land use aren't, you know, working well together. So I mean, I'll touch on a bunch of these things, but that's just sort of a little bit about who I am and what I do. I should say a little something about my organization. It's a nonprofit that operates out of Washington, D.C., but all over the country. It has some other programs that have other names. Sometimes people run into these, like the National Complete Streets Coalition, Transportation for America, the Governor's Institute on Community Design, the Form-Based Codes Institute, anyway, a bunch of these different sort of brands, which are mostly different ways in which we deliver our programs. So Locus, for instance, is for real estate developers. So we work with real estate developers who are trying to do, you know, what we would consider more kind of progressive development, although I guess you could also say more traditional development, because it's really about making urban places work. And by urban, I don't necessarily mean big city. I mean also towns, the way they always used to be constructed, but I'll say more about that in a while. We have a local leaders council for local elected officials. I was actually one of those before I came to work for Smart Growth America. State Smart Transportation Initiative is a program that's in affiliation with the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and they've got about half a dozen or so really smart people with PhDs who are doing a lot of really interesting, innovative work on transportation planning. So anyway, that's just a general thing. I'll answer questions on this or anything else. And by the way, feel free to stop me at any point. If I'm going too fast, slow me down. If you have a question on anything or don't follow something or disagree, please jump in. So, what I want to talk about, and we had this heading on it, which is basically about what changes that are going on in our society, particularly, you know, with the economy and technology and demographics, what that means for the development of the country, and particularly for the way we practice economic development at the local level. And I say economic development, I mean it in the broadest sense of, you know, whatever we're doing, besides the folks who, somebody here is with the Economic Development Agency, right? Yeah. But all of us, right, are working essentially for the prosperity of our local communities. You know, if you're a planner, if you're the Chamber of Commerce, all of us are focused to some degree, and certainly elected officials. So what I want to talk about is how that has changed in this century from what we had as sort of hard ingrained habits in the 20th century, you know, has changed in the 21st century. But let me start with just something that is a point I'm going to come back to a lot, so I'm going to put it out front first. Ed Glazer is an economist, fairly well known. This book, The Triumph of the City, that got fairly popular, but he's also known among, you know, nerdy academic kind of economists. This is, you know, one of the things, one of the many ways I'll make this point. And this says, there's a very strong track record of places that attract talent becoming places of long-term success. The most successful economic development policy is to attract and retain smart people and then get out of their way. A theme we'll return to. This is from 2 days ago, when, as you may have heard, Amazon, their long-awaited announcement for their headquarters to whatever that meant. I never really did understand what it meant to have a second headquarters. It turns out they're gonna have 2 second headquarters. So, but I thought what the statement from a vice president there who said they looked at 100 aspects of each location. They had 238 applicants. They looked at 100 aspects of each location, but, quote, during the process, it became clear to us that the overriding criteria was going to be the ability to find and attract talent. All right, now I'm gonna go back in time and talk a little bit about the way we made cities and towns for, like, kind of forever. Because civilization, by which I mean people living in cities, is something like 10,000 years old, give or take, we don't know exactly, but it's something like that, when people started agglomerating. Before that, our ancestors lived for tens of thousands of years, basically in small groups, you know, hunting and gathering and that kind of thing. And somewhere around 10,000 years ago, we had something called the Neolithic Revolution, which was basically agriculture, and we started making towns, villages, these places of agglomeration. And we've been doing that ever since, and of course they've gotten bigger and bigger and more complex. We were mostly rural until very, very recently. That is, even with all the cities in the world, the population mostly lived in the country because it took more people to make the food for everybody than, you know, it took a majority of folks. And that was true everywhere in the world until about 19th century in England, the first place that had a bigger urban population than rural population. And it didn't happen here. Anybody know when? It's about the 1920s was the first time there was a bigger urban population than rural population. And 100 years later, less than 100 years later, I think it was 2008, the world became majority urban. So, you know, this is obviously a pretty radical change. So we have this 10,000 year history of making cities, towns, villages. And I would say that up until about the last, 80 years or so, we made them really one way. Wherever they were, wherever they're in the world, where we find archaeological remnants, we find some similar things. There was typically some kind of grid of streets. They were small and compact. They had defined public spaces. You knew what public was, you knew what private was. There was a clear urban-rural boundary. I mean, there were typically a wall around a city, because it had to be. That everything was within walking distance, because it had to be, because how else would you get anywhere? And that was true, that was ancient Babylonia. This is Greece, the plain of Piraeus, which was the port of Athens. This is a Roman city that I think was somewhere in England or Wales. And again, you see the same kind of patterns all over the place. This is ancient America, well, not so ancient, but colonial Williamsburg. Again, same kind of thing, major roads designated, grid of streets, places for public buildings, buildings fronted on streets. Regulations usually said the building has to come up to a certain point of the street. That's the 17th century in America. Here's the 19th century in America. Anybody recognize this place?
Crossroads of America City.
Yeah, yeah. I'm never really sure in a community like this, we got them over there, exactly how you feel about them over there. So, but it's obviously a prominent city, and also an excellent example of planning in the old style. Well, here's one maybe a little bit more familiar. I love this. I love these 19th century maps that they seem to have done. Everywhere I go, I'm usually able to find one of these. But again, you see the same thing. The grid of streets. And that model was used at different scales for little towns, medium-sized cities, big cities. We had the same pattern. Typically, the grid of streets, it's compact, meaning it's walkable to things, pretty much anything you need. You got a mix of building types. This is obviously not a big city. This is a small place, but none of the buildings are more than about 4 stories. But it's actually quite dense and compact. And if you could live here and you might work here or go to school here and you could walk to everything, that's the way we made towns. And it's kind of that way everywhere in the world, because there seems to be something related to what it is to be human. And so in the 19th century, as I said, because of the Industrial Revolution, cities did start getting bigger. We got new technology. We went from being agricultural to being increasingly manufacturing, and cities became really important. They also became messy, and having a whole lot of people living together in greater and greater numbers without the good infrastructure to support that leads to all kinds of not fun things. Of course, factories, particularly back then, you know, you couldn't hardly see, you know, in some cities you couldn't see a block away because of the smoke. They didn't necessarily have great public health if you didn't have the infrastructure for water and sewage and, you know, sanitary conditions. Then, you know, things could get to be a real mess, and cities got to be, you know, known for this, and they got a bad reputation. City life wasn't always great. In fact, in the 1880s, so this is about the time you're really seeing a lot of this industrialization, the biggest cause of death were infectious diseases, like tuberculosis, cholera, yellow fever, and so on, that were very much related to inadequate public health systems and overcrowded cities. Overcrowded in the sense that there were more people than the infrastructure could really support. And, you know, these problems existed in all the cities in the West anyway, at that time. So in the early 20th century, very progressive thinking people decided to deal with this problem and come up with a solution. And specifically, in the city of New York, which was the biggest and had the biggest problems, they put a commission to work and came up with a plan to deal with this, which was driven in part by the fear of the big buildings blocking out the light in New York as skyscrapers started to go up, but also very much about public health issues. And so they came up with these recommendations for a very extensive code of regulation. So some of them are things that involve separation of uses, like, you know, in those days, although there were automobiles by that point, there still mostly were lots of horses. And horses need fuel too, and that fuel's called hay, and you have to store it. And so they would have buildings where they'd have, you know, the equivalent of a garage now, right? And they'd have hay stacked up as well as having the horses. And, well, hay is highly flammable. And so there'd be people living above, and, you know, there were just enough fires, I guess, and enough people died, people realized maybe that's not a good idea. So they wrote things like into the code that you had to separate these kind of uses, right? So, so that made sense. They defined different kinds of streets, and they basically proposed the first zoning code, which was 1916, I would say. And there's the report, it says 1916, so there. So that was where zoning started. And around the country, people, particularly people in real estate development, thought this was a good idea, because they thought it would enhance the value of real estate if you could know that, you know, things next, what your neighbors were gonna have, and so it became kind of a movement during the progressive era to promote this. So a few years later, there was an effort at the national level to promulgate this all around the country. And it was during the presidency of Calvin Coolidge. Anybody know anything about Calvin Coolidge? Calvin Coolidge was not the most activist president. Will Rogers, I think, said, the people wanted nothing done, he done it. So, you know, he wasn't necessarily a guy out there, but he had a very exuberant, energetic Secretary of Commerce. And you know who that was?
Hoover.
You get the star. Herbert Hoover, yeah. I think he was just a second hit the button before you. So Herbert Hoover, who promoted a lot of things as Secretary of Commerce, his period as Secretary of Commerce was much more distinguished than his presidency, which, as you may know, didn't work out that well. But as Secretary of Commerce, he promoted like broadcasting and, you know, hydropower and all kinds of things. And they came to him and said, you know, this is really going to be a good thing for development. So he promulgated this through his department as a kind of a model, what we now call a model ordinance, which partly explains the fact it's always interested me because, you know, if you work in this country, 50 states, you find they all have different constitutions, different laws, things are different all over the place, right? Zoning is remarkably similar from state to state. And part of it is because it did come from this one national movement, you know, a uniform kind of code that was initially promulgated. So they spread it out all over the country, and then it went to the Supreme Court because somebody challenged it in a famous case, Ambler Realty versus Euclid, city of Euclid, Ohio. And anyway, I think it was 26 or 27, something like that. The Supreme Court ruled that zoning is not a taking, which meant basically it's okay, you can do that if you follow some procedures. And that okayed it, and then, you know, it really spread. And after World War II, of course, lots of places that hadn't done it did it. And as you may know, every major city other than Houston did it. But most communities have this kind of zoning. So we had zoning everywhere. And of course, it moved along with time. And in particular, it moved from the cities to the suburbs, as we all moved to the suburbs. And we got a whole new approach that has sometimes been called Euclidian zoning, which I think is partly a play on Euclidean geometry, but is really a reference to Euclid, Ohio, in that court case. Trivia you don't need to know, but maybe you'll be on Jeopardy someday. So, the main point of this, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar with this, is, you have fragmented land use so that there's a different function for everything. We put our industry over here, because we don't want to live by that. We put our, our commerce, where we're gonna go shopping, in other places over here. We put our places we live in these separate places, and then we, have places we go to school or go have city hall or something like that. And all of them are connected by highway, usually by a single arterial road that we all have to use, and we feed into this. We lost the grid of streets, and of course, one thing that happened in parallel with this was we had the growth of the automobile institutional structure and planning for that. And we separated those things really early in the 20th century. Basically, planning went over to these new guys called planners, and they were mostly at the local level, right? Because local basically controls the zoning stuff. And then transportation, we handed to transportation engineers, because it seems like it's a technical kind of thing, and needs engineers, and they'll figure it out. And we assumed you could do those things separately, and basically from that part early in the 20th century, they really did go on separate tracks, especially as transportation moved more and more to the state level, so it's really divorced from local planning to a large degree. So, this is what we had as we really got crazy about the automobile. Now again, the cars, of course, were here in the first part of the 20th century, but most people didn't have them. And after Long Depression and World War II and New Prosperity, we're growing like crazy, and everybody can have a car now. And of course, everybody wants one. So that's great. And to facilitate that, the federal government puts in place a major program to build highways, federal funding, handing lots of money to states and localities to build roads. And we have other new programs that relate to this and essentially say, you don't have to live in the city, move out to the country in the new suburbs, which is promoted not only by the highways that get you there, but also by federal programs that support home building. The federal government will help you get a new house in the suburb. It will not help you fix up the place in the city, but it will help you go to a green field. We got new rules for capital depreciation, so if you're selling stuff and you have a store, it doesn't necessarily make sense anymore to fix up the old place on Main Street. It pays a lot to build some cheap building out by the highway, and it's only got to last 5, 6, 7 years, and you're gonna strip off that front and put some ephes on the front, redo whatever, So there's a whole set of governmental regulations, federal, state, and local, taxes, rules, subsidies, that promote this as this is the new American dream. And it works. We leave the cities. We move into these new suburbs, big time. And basically, by 1970, the majority of jobs in America have left the center city and moved out. So first the people basically went out, and then the jobs kind of followed. And then, of course, shopping, because then we create these great big new shopping centers and malls, and that totally kills the downtown. Whether we're talking about a big city like Detroit, or we're talking about medium-sized cities and smaller towns, we sort of hollow them out by this whole set of practices. And that's the way things were going right up through the 1990s. We were spreading out, and it looked like that trend was never going to change. Why would anyone want to go back? When I was growing up, cities were definitely a place to escape from. My family did, and they weren't places you necessarily wanted to be. So we had these new places we lived in, where most of the people, most Americans still do live, ruled by zoning, which again characterized by particularly extreme separation of uses as opposed to the mixed use that was the nature of a city or a town. And everything, of course, is about the automobile. And instead of having a grid of streets, we have this hierarchy of, you know, arterial roads and then secondary streets, and there's basically one path everywhere. And of course, walking is obviously old school. Nobody does that anymore. And we live in places that, you know, this is the desirable place by the late 20th century to want to live in one of these pods built everywhere. This is the you know, prime retail, no longer Main Street. It's now a place with ample parking always and a single purpose, small, you know, low single-story building typically. And of course, the prime office location becomes the office park by the highway. Again, ample parking. Now, you know, even from one building to another, the walking environment is not so great. We'll give you a cafeteria though, so you don't ever have to leave the building. This, by the way, is from Research Triangle Park, which is, in a sense, the you know, the classic granddaddy of all you know, office parks. Maybe the most successful one ever in some ways, high tech and all that. And now worrying about its future and looking to create a downtown, but I'll get to that later. So, you know, where we used to live in places like this, where the houses, you know, were relatively close together. We have, you know, porches, you know, you can imagine seeing your neighbor when you walk out on the street here and saying hi or something like that. You know, there's a place for cars, but, you know, clearly there's trees and sidewalk, and the infrastructure exists for people who aren't operating an automobile. And we went from that to that, which I always have to tell people, I know it only looks like there's garages here, but trust me, there's actually a dwelling for the owner of the car. You know, but you know who's more important, the car or the owner here, right? And what you don't see, of course, is any provision for pedestrians. This happens to be in Ohio, right next to where my in-laws live. So my mother-in-law wants to go for a walk. She basically has to walk around these streets here. You can tell it's snow country though, right? Because you know, that's not like anything else would tell you where the street was once it's covered in snow. Yeah. So anyway, so we changed to this new dream, and we adjusted our lifestyle accordingly in various ways. And this was great because this is the American dream. This is what we all want. The whole rest of the world wants this, right? And we're really happy. What's that? Somebody said something about vacation.
Yes, the movie, sorry.
Well, I was thinking about vacation. Yeah. Vacation, because the funny thing is that on vacation we don't go to this place, right? Nobody goes to a place like this on vacation. Where do we go on vacation? This is when I first started noticing things. I think
Charleston, Savannah.
Charleston, Savannah.
Water.
So beaches and water's another thing. But think of the places people like to go. So I noticed early the places that impressed me when I was younger were Williamsburg, Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg. Because, you know, when they first took me, I was like, I never seen anything like that. And it was like, oh, this is like a whole town, you know, and you walked around to stuff, and it seemed like this could be a cool place to live, you know, even though it was so 100 years, you know, ancient. You know, but you'd go to, you know, you go to Disney World or Disneyland, and what do you got? You got a Main Street, and you walk around. You leave your car, you go walking around. You go to Europe, and you go to some cute little town, or you go to Paris, and it's all about walking, right? It's a completely different environment. We don't go here on our vacation. So it's kind of interesting, but that's okay. We get a couple weeks of vacation a year, so we can enjoy that. That's the way America was until fairly recently, and then things really started changing. And they changed in a lot of different ways. We've noticed, for instance, all that movement of companies out, which seemed like it was unending, started reversing. We had a trend of companies moving to cities, to urban areas, beginning about 15, maybe 20 years ago, but really showing up in the last 10 years. And we did a study on this, I'll show some more. You know, the main streets started coming back. People started rediscovering, you know, not only those old buildings, but the way you could do interesting things in them, and you create something that was more than just the individual property, right? When you have all these drive-to commercial places, you know, each one is its separate thing, and no place is particularly important. You could pick that up, move it somewhere else, and that's what people do, leaving those things behind. And when you have something like this, which this happens to be in Pennsylvania, you have something going on where there's synergies among them. You know, the coffee shop and the bike shop and the place people go to sit and have Wi-Fi and do various kinds of things and meet people gets kind of rediscovered. And that's in the cities and towns and the main streets. The other side of this is on the suburban side. And suburbs start having to reposition themselves. And this is going to be the big, since most of us actually do live in suburban areas, most of the American population still is in the suburbs, although much of it is trying to get out of them. Most of what's going to happen, there's sort of two sides to this. One is the rejuvenation of the old centers, and the second is the creation of some new centers in places that were without center, which is to say the vast suburbs. This is a book that came out in February. Not the only one to talk about this, but it's a good one that talks about how this is happening around the country and gives a number of good examples. I'm going to come to this, but I'm also going to use a little data from this. So some of this has to do with demographics, and I just want to talk about a little bit now. When you look at what is happening among particularly the millennial generation and some extent Gen Xers, which is say the main people occupied the workforce now and are coming into the workforce, it's very noticeable that people in this age group, 25 to 49 prime working years, if they're educated, they're moving to urban centers. So some data shows like, well, there's as many millennials in the suburbs and as there were before, but when you actually look at their education levels, what it paints a picture of is of a group of people who, if they have skills and can earn incomes, they get to move to the city. And those who don't are the ones who are kind of stuck, not necessarily where they want to be, because this is where they're going. Housing values show this. In the last, since the century started, it's basically values going up in the cities far ahead of the values in the suburbs, which was the reverse, of course, of what it used to be. Office rents are showing this quite dramatically, that suburban office locations are really suffering. City locations are booming.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but that last slide there.
Yeah.
Says storage operators tap into the market of empty office space.
Yeah.
That just happened at 3 different office buildings in this city.
Is that right?
City council just approved zoning variances for 3 different. Church of God Ministries building is now self-storage. Kmart North on Broadway is turning into self-storage. Point is, this is very relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to make kind of a side point related to that, there, with all the changes going on, there's of course the retail side of things, where the retail business is getting hit in a number of different ways, but online being one of them. So the actual demand for retail space is not necessarily what it was, and office space also shrinking, partly because of people doing more business with less, but also because less and less space and people working in different kinds of environments. Everything's trying to reduce the space. So having a surfeit of office and retail space is part of the issue we face generally. Overall, though, what this adds up to in economic terms, real estate, is that there's a price-value premium for walkable places. We see it in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different studies. It's now getting to become fairly commonplace, but so a couple of my colleagues did this study twice, actually. This one they're going to do again this coming year, doing it about on a 3-year basis, but this was 2016. Looked at the top 30 U.S. metropolitan areas and compared the walkable places with the car-oriented places in terms of real estate, in terms of commercial real estate, basically. Office, retail, rental, multifamily. In every single one of the top 30, there was a rental rate premium for the walkable over the drivable. Overall, the average was a 74% for drivable over, for walkable over drivable. And all of them were showing market share gains in the walkable areas. So again, it's not just the coast or something like that, it's everywhere. This is, another study. This is from a commercial real estate publication explaining to people who need to do this stuff why walkability is important. So I said I was an economist, right? So you're going to get a few graphs. So I'll try not to make it too painful, but this is something that comes out of Moody's. They have a thing online called Real Capital Analytics, and This I found very interesting. You can set this up so, in this case, we're looking for around 2000, 2001, up until the last year of data was 2016, let's say, and divide the real estate into those, these are commercial properties again, in what are central business districts, the old central business districts, highly walkable, to at the other end, the totally car-dependent suburban locations. And in between, we have walkable suburban, because there are those places, somewhat, so it's by degree essentially. And what you see is, here's their index from this year, from 2000, okay, so they're all together. So what's happening? And you see the blue, which is the walkable, is rising above the orange, which is the drivable. Now it peaks here, this is the boom in the 2000s, and then of course we have the recession. So here's the crash, everything drops, right? But if you'll notice, that gap widens. So some properties fall more than others, and they're the ones that are in the drivable locations. And then we come out, everything comes back up again, and in the recovery, but notice the gap widening. So I mean, this reflects the fact that we built so much of that drivable stuff when we were booming that we way outpaced the market, and we have a shortage of this. So, it's quite dramatic here. Okay. So why is this happening now? And now is when I want to talk a little bit more about the changes that are going on. The shift to the knowledge economy, and what I mean by that again, through the 19th century, the United States basically an agricultural place, the 17th, 18th, 19th century. In the 20th century, we became a manufacturing place. Now that doesn't mean we stopped doing agriculture. We in fact became the biggest agricultural producer in the world, but it was driven by manufacturing in many ways, and the things that came in with manufacturing that made agriculture more productive. But an economy that was driven by agriculture became an economy driven by manufacturing. And in the 20th century, we learned how to do that. And that means not only the people that did the manufacturing, but the rest of our society and government, all that, we learned how to work with a manufacturing economy. That's not the economy we have now. Manufacturing is about 10, 11% of the national economy, something like that. We still do it. It's not unimportant, but it's a smaller piece. And it involves far less people. One of the more interesting statistics come out of the recession. 2008, 2009, things crash. Of course, we had a tremendous hit in manufacturing, as I'm sure everybody in this part of the country is particularly well aware of. We got back up to the level as a nation, the level of production in manufacturing about, I think it was about 3 years ago, something like that. I forget the exact date. So, it took us 6 or 7 years, we got back to where we were before, with 1 million fewer people working in it. So it's not just that manufacturing is a smaller part of the economy, it's that it employs less, fewer and fewer people as technology improves and so on. What's driving things now in the 21st century is this knowledge economy, for lack of a better word. So what we mean by that is obviously high tech, but not just high tech in the narrow sense, not just people who do computer programming or coding or the stuff my son does that I don't understand, but they seem to be paying well for. What we mean is it's driving everything in the economy, right? Because there's nothing you do that isn't driven in a large way by this, right? We're all dependent on these things now. People make fortunes by figuring out some new way to make this gizmo we carry around do something for us, right? If you're into distributing retail goods, that's a very traditional thing, and that's being taken over by a big multinational company that just announced its new headquarters 2 and 2A or whatever that's, right? Driving people around to taxi service, that's a very traditional thing, but now that's been taken over by companies that figured out how to use this. So this is, the point is, this is what's driving our economy now, and it's one of the places, well, it's one of the few places we still have a bit of an edge on the rest of the world. The second part is demographics, which is driven by the retirement of the baby boom and the rise of the millennials, a big shift, and shifting preferences, which in part reflects the nature of the demographic change. So let's say in the economic side, as I said, this one guy had this line, from tools and spools to eds and meds. I mean, it's the dominant local thing now is not the factory as much as it is hospitals and universities, and they're important both as big employers, but also as centers that attract people with skills and knowledge. In the manufacturing economy, we, at the local level, chased smokestacks. We wanted the factory. Or we wanted the shopping mall and things like that, but they were the big thing that were gonna locate. The manufacturing was often driven, of course, by natural resources. The factory's gonna be here because it's one of the places that's, you know, by a river that's connected closely to the natural resource you need. You're gonna need coal from here and it's expensive, so I'm putting my plant here and I'll have a rail line there, that kind of thing. The knowledge economy, the resources are human. It's workers you need, and this is why I started by saying this is very much about talent. So economic development before, again, was attracting those places and those big uses.
Knoxville.
What's that?
It's Knoxville.
It is in fact very close to Knoxville. It's south of there. I think it might be a little closer to Chattanooga.
No, it's closer to
Close Knoxville, is it?
It's between the two there.
Okay.
Level Road is, it's just you come in off.
You know it better than I do. I did in fact get this slide in the next one from a woman from Tennessee, so. So, you know, this is 40 years ago, and you know, we'd build a highway, we'd expand the highway. As we expand the highway, guess what? Instant economic growth. Throw in a few tax incentives, you know, we got an economy. And that's the way we do things. But things, as I said, have changed. This was a survey of corporate executives, and here's, I think, the significant takeaway. It said this year the highway accessibility and labor cost factors, again, the manufacturing era, what do we care about? Cheap labor and location to a highway. The highway accessibility and labor cost factors were outranked by the availability of skilled labor. And guy from the president of the Florida Chamber of Commerce was quoted as saying, talent is replacing the tax incentives, the #1 economic development tool in America. All right, so now let's talk about the demographics and why that matters. There's millennials, and they're different. How are they different? Well, what's a millennial? Everybody knows what a millennial is now, right? I mean, it's like become, when I first started doing this stuff, I had to tell people what it meant, but now we argue about exactly what constitutes it. Like I've got one kid who says, well, he's not really a millennial the same as his younger sister, because, you know, there's a divide there in the 80s or 90s or something, I don't know. But for these purposes, we're talking about somebody who reached young adulthood somewhere around the year 2000 or so. And, you know, because this is a big generation, we're studying the heck out of them. There's a lot of things that, we can all agree about, but I don't know how that got in there. It's not that funny in the back of the room. I have 3 millennials myself, so yeah, I'm responsible. No, the main thing to know about millennials is that they follow lifestyle, not jobs. I used to have to explain that to people and show the statistics and the survey data, but now I said because, oh yeah, this is what my kid's going here, you know. So, you know, they don't just say, where am I gonna hire now? I'm moving to Pittsburgh or something like that. They say, I wanna live here, and then they go look for the job. And so if they have, you know, some kind of skills, then they're in a good position, and that's who companies want. What do they want? Well, the National Association of Realtors has been surveying this for a long time, and year after year they keep going back with things that say they want a place they can walk. This, of course, has created an issue for suburban areas, where now it's the suburbs losing their kids, basically. More in some places than others, but it's definitely the trend. This one interested me. This is from a newspaper that looked at this sort of downtown apartment demand, you know, these old places, and there's this nice young couple, and they're explaining why they were living in this downtown area, and they say, we know in summer everybody's going to be congregating where we live. It's very social oriented. It's just really exciting for us to be here, and we see this great value because of that. We're happy to pay a slight premium to be close to all these things that enrich our lives. So this is a downtown resident. Now, the reason this interests me in particular was, this isn't New York, this isn't Chicago, this isn't San Francisco. This is Grand Rapids, Michigan. So, you know, again, this is what we're finding. It's not just the people that want to move, you know, to Manhattan. It's all over. Again, millennials also seem to they consume experiences more than things. I love this one from Business. Millennials are renting instead of buying, and the retail is freaking out. The is freaking out. Well, you know, I mean, I collected record albums. There's a few people here who remember those. Some of you remember cassette tapes, right? And then we had CDs, right? And now what we have is some kind of streaming thing that has the whole library of everything ever recorded in the history of civilization, and you don't need all that stuff, right? So, you know, it's a different way of living.
Sorry, can we point out that in 2001, Grand Rapids was highlighted as the fastest dying city in America?
Is that right?
And then they came together, did the big lit dub, the day the music died or something, Bye Bye American Pie. And it's from this artist group of people, it started that revolution of looking back into the core. And then, now you have it as an attractive city again.
And it's very much not a dying place now. That happens to my office mate back at SGA is from Grand Rapids, and so I hear about it from out. They have a BRT now, and, you know, they have, apparently a pretty vibrant scene going. I haven't visited it myself, but good point. I'm sorry, bus rapid transit, so new transit investment. My daughter sent me this. I don't know, I thought it was funny. You're unfortunate, like to buy a Val, aren't you a millennial side, like to rent a Val? And the move away from cars is the most striking thing, because it makes no sense to me, because when I was a kid, all I knew was I wanted my car, you know, I saved to get a car, to get my license to have a car. My buddies and I wanted to work on cars, and I had a son, he didn't care about the car, he wanted to work on a computer. Okay, what else? So now, here's an interesting thing though, when surveying the preferences for where you wanna live, they asked, realtors asked millennials, you know, what kind of place, and basically they gave them the choice of the big city. And almost half of them want that, you know, they watch Friends or whatever, and they wanna be there. But 40% of them said they wanna live in a small town or city. Which means that they want the same kind of qualities, but they didn't really want the big city, they want a smaller place. And this is clearly opportunity for lots of smaller town America trying to figure out, you know, what to do in this world. The interesting thing to me was only 12% of them picked the drivable suburb. It's interesting because that's where most of them grew up, right? And that's not what they want. Okay, I can say this again and again, there's been so many headlines, young, smart people like dense walkable communities, so top companies are moving there. There's your basic answer. We did this study, what we called Core Values, where we actually looked at, we tracked as many as we could get. We found 500 cases from 2010 to 2015, so post-recession, where companies moved, you know, made a location decision and moved to the city. And we ran some data on, but we also interviewed, and we just called them up and said, so why'd you pick this? And we got a lot of interesting quotes. This one I liked, particularly from a place that moved into, a software company moved into Cleveland. It said, our younger employees don't want to go to a suburban office park. It's boring as all get out there. Here they walk outside and see cool stuff and it's fun. I wanted to be where they wanted to be. Like a statement. Anybody know where this is? Yeah, it's the, what do they call it, the cultural trail. Again, I'm not sure about how unsafe ground I am. I'm not saying anything about going good in Indy, but.
No, you're fine.
Okay,
You're
good.
fine.
There's lots of places I go, they don't
Well,
talk about
we
that.
don't hate anybody here. So.
Good, that's great.
I've been on that trail many times.
But, so it's really interesting though, because it's a relatively small, as street infrastructure goes, it's a relatively small investment, and it's had tremendous payback. Right down to one of the things we found in some of this work was that there are a couple of companies that said they would move to downtown Indianapolis, but they had to have a location on this trail. A couple of big companies. So, you know, again, sign of the times. Okay, now to us folks, who are on the other side of this. The greatest generation ever, well.
Until history's rewritten.
Until history's rewritten. by our kids, who are now more than us, and now control the workforce and everything else.
I see it coming.
But every year more and more of us are retiring. I'm not there yet, but, you know. But we're not quite the same. One thing is we're living longer, and but we were active. So we're not quite, you know, ready for the rocking chair. We're a little different. We're a little more likely to want to not drive. I've gotten that way. I went from being the kid who just wanted the car and everything to I just don't like to drive anymore. And more older folks are, you know, getting into using public transportation, even if they never used it when they were younger. Bicycling is actually way up among older folks. You know, we want an active lifestyle. We want to be near things. We don't want to be cut off. And, you know, again, it's not everybody, but again, this is the trend kind of pushing the margin in real estate. One of the things that also emerged was, you know, we did a lot of creating senior places for seniors to live. And it turned out a lot of seniors don't want to live in a lot of those places. houses, partly because they tend to be put in isolated places where you're stuck there. And if you no longer can drive or have your car, that means you're stuck waiting for somebody to take you any place you have to go. So the average age moving into these places went from like 70 to 85. People don't go until they have no other choice. They want to age in place, and they want to live in a community. It's a community, if possible, you know, go to the same place they went to church every Sunday and shop in the same places, but they'll move out of their house and move into a more urban location. We have this rise of, you know, ever heard of a NORC, a naturally occurring retirement community, which is basically when a whole bunch of folks found this is a great building to live in by the, you know, in my community, it's by the subway station, you know, and so they all moved there, and all of a sudden, you know, there's all these older folks in one building that wasn't specifically a senior place. Anyway, I think I made this point. But what this means is that we have smaller households because we have people at the top end living longer, which is basically couples and then singles. And at the lower end, of course, we have the younger people forming families later, getting married later, having kids later, having fewer kids. So downsizing households on the upside of this will account for 85% of the demand share over the next 20 years, according to Professor Chris Nelson down at Arizona. And that affects the demand for housing. So when you put the two together, starter households and downsizers are about 84% of the new housing market through 2035. Both groups generally seeking smaller and more affordable homes. So we built a whole lot of stuff for a world in which, you know, half the country was mom, dad, and a couple of kids, because that's when I was born, that was basically the demographics, to now having a world in which at most a quarter of the households, you know, are parents and children. So we have a mismatch. And sometimes people ask me, well, isn't this just going to go back the other way, because the millennials, you know, they've put it off because of the recession, but now they're going to go do the same thing. Won't we have the same thing before? This is probably, however, a permanent structural change. In fact, as an economist, I can say, you know, our ability to forecast any time out is not the best. I once knew a forecaster who said, give them a date, give them a number, never both. You know, I can't, and I'm not a forecaster, but even economic forecasters can't easily tell you what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years, right? We can tell you that over that period, there's probably going to be a cycle and there'll still be a recession at some point, right? But we can't tell you. Demographics is something we can actually predict pretty well, because there's the life cycle of a human being. You know, there's not too much that changes it unless you have, you know, massive war and, you know, something great death, you know, or massive influx of folks from somewhere else. It doesn't change that much. So we actually have a pretty good idea of what demographics look like a generation ahead. As I said, you know, we had these households that were half and half. Now we're basically households with no children. This is to give you an idea. Now, so this is a demographic pyramid. Some people here may have seen this kind of thing. So this is male on one side, female on the other side. But this is the ages. So by 5, so this is 0 to 5, 5 to 9, and so on. So these are the older folks. These are the younger folks. And if you looked at 1960, late in the baby boom, and these are the baby boomers. So the baby boomers by then are from just being born to 15 years of age, okay? 46 being the beginning of the baby boom. And I'm gonna show you what happens over time as these folks get older. So we go to, oops, what happened?
Wrong one.
I went the wrong way, that's what happened, okay. So here's 1970, so we'll go back in. So you see it's moving up, that's the baby boom generation moving up. And new folks coming in, sorry, I'm in your way. And there we go, it moves up again, and again, and again. And do you notice what's happening here? Here's 2020, so we're almost there. Here's what it'll look like by 2030, here's what it'll look like by 2040. You notice what happened? So, you know, these are the millennials, right? There's a lot of them. There's more of them now than there are of us baby boomers. But if you look back at 1960, it's no longer a pyramid. It's no longer a demographic pyramid. It's almost a rectangle. So this is to say that it's not just that the baby boom's aging. It's that the composition, the age composition of society is changing. So household composition for the 21st century is going to be very different than it was in the latter part of the 20th century. And that has big implications, particularly this big mismatch. 62% of the U.S. Household home stock, our supply of housing, 60% of it is single family. 22% of our households are married couples with children. That's a mismatch. And that explains why prices are doing what prices are doing. So, what does this mean for policy? Well, there are a lot of implications, and particularly, as I was saying, urban areas, meaning whether it's the big city down Central Business District or downtown Anderson, have an opportunity. Suburbs have a real challenge. The companies are leaving. I've said this before. This was about McDonald's leaving to suburbs for the city. This was just earlier this year in New Jersey. This is the thing we built all over the place for corporations, and there's a whole lot of them sitting empty now. And they were the source of tax base for suburbs, and they're not coming back. Obviously, all this retail places that are empty, malls that have been dying. This one actually, this guy snuck in and took pictures and did this book on dying malls. And this one is near Cleveland, where my wife's from. And I remember when we were younger going to this mall. It was the fanciest place, And then I saw this picture, I couldn't believe it. This was really interesting to me. A study a couple of years now, but Newmark Grubb, Knight and Frank is a company that serves the commercial real estate industry. The title tells you everything. Suburban office obsolescence. It basically tells you if you don't have walkability, you could be in a lot of trouble, and talks about what you need to do to compete. Another part of this is that with this movement in, what's happening is the level of wealth. We went through generations where the wealth was in the suburbs and the cities were poor, and then we got used to talking that way. When we said inner city, we meant poor. And now we're seeing an inversion of all this with growing poverty in the suburbs. Yeah. All right, now I want to just digress for a bit here to talk about the fiscal side of things, because again, this is one aspect of this is what does it cost to do business as a local government to provide services to your citizens. And one of the things that we found, it was pointed out in the 1970s in a famous publication called The Cost of Sprawl, but nobody really paid much attention to it or did much about it. But we know that sprawl is expensive because providing the infrastructure and the services when taxpayers are relatively spread out and taxable properties are spread out compared to a denser place, it's more expensive. You have to, if you think about it, the number of taxpayers you're spreading the cost of this street, a foot of street, is fewer. The number of taxpayers you're spreading the cost of the infrastructure under the street, the water, the sewer, the storm drains. The number of taxpayers you're spreading on the cost of the things you do on top of the street, fire, police, school buses, trash collection. So all of those things drive local budgets. And it's less efficient when you're more spread out. There's more area to cover, more miles of road, and so on. The infrastructure itself is more expensive, the maintenance of it, and operation is more expensive. So we started analyzing this a few years ago and developed a model and procedure so that communities could do scenario planning and look at alternatives. If we grow in the future, we could grow the way we've been growing, more green fields, or what if we do infill? Grow more compact, in a more compact way. Maybe infill in our existing centers, or at least if we're gonna do greenfield, do it smaller rather than more spread out. And compare it in terms of what it means in net fiscal terms. Take the costs of the new development, take the revenue you're gonna get, what does that look like? So this is what we started doing. For identifying the services that are particularly related to geography, because not everything is, right? Central administration might be the same regardless, but roads clearly are, where I have to locate fire stations, school buses, and so on. And so we can look at different scenarios, like if you imagine this, this particular jurisdiction, it's been developing like this all over here, but what if it just develops like here, or like there? What does that mean in net fiscal terms? And this is some of the ways it makes a difference. Lower density means you have more, which means you're spreading out the cost over a larger area over various taxpayers. Particularly when you look at things like water and sanitary, which are usually charged on a per unit basis. What that means is that people in low-density areas wind up being subsidized by high-density areas. I use 1,000 gallons, you use 1,000 gallons, we get charged the same amount. But if I'm living out here, it actually costs more to deliver to me than you over here. And that's one of the ways we sort of bias the incentives for our policy. So we've done this in a lot of places. I should update this slide. This is an old slide. I'm sorry. So there's probably twice as many there now. We did do Indianapolis a couple of years ago. We're working in Hawaii now, Hawaii County. We did a big one in Florida last year. But I'll just give you an example. So this was Macon, Georgia, which is kind of like Indianapolis and Marion. Macon-Bibb is a unified county, which was useful for doing this kind of analysis. And you did 4 scenarios and basically said, keep doing what you're doing, which is developing all over. And what we found out was that low-density greenfield development was going to bring in less in tax dollars than it would cost to serve it. Now, if you did the greenfield, but you did it in a more efficient, compact way, then you could turn it positive. On the other hand, if you did downtown infill, you got a premium. You got, what this means is that you can actually increase services or lower taxes or some combination. And that was all assuming no benefit from this is really about a mayor who wanted to, was trying to revitalize the downtown. Downtown's starting to come back. And you need to be able to show everyone else who represents the whole county why it's of interest to them. And so that's part of what this illustrates. This is just on really basically on the cost side, assuming revenues don't change. In fact, we know that when you have a revitalized downtown, revenues spike. You get a lot more in tax dollars. So, with that, you could turn it even more positive. Anyway, this is an example. This just shows how changing density changes costs. This is very low suburban densities. Now, this is a high density, but this is to show we're not talking about Hong Kong here, or New York or something. This is a Vermont village, so. But you'll notice that just with that, you significantly lower the cost, 25% reduction in the cost of these services. And if you get up to here, which is sort of townhouse level, so really high development, right? I mean, they're townhouses, they're not skyscrapers.
Seems like between those two as well, particularly in Vancouver, where it's been green space construction, but they've been almost a zero lot line between residences,
exactly.
like you might see in a townhouse.
Yeah.
But there'd be what they call gardens or backyards.
Yeah.
It would be of some size.
Yeah, and that's part of the lesson is that this is not just about whether you want to be big city. The ways we used to do things in fairly small places were a lot more efficient. Okay, let me just to make that point. Okay, and then on the revenue side, as I said, you don't get a lot of revenue per acre in a suburban setting. You get a lot where you have main streets and dense mixed-use areas where there are these synergies among businesses and people. We did this again. This is from Macon, and what we found was that if you looked at the revenue per acre, this is property tax, but revenue per acre, you have definite hotspots. And what was really striking was that this is downtown Macon, which was basically emptied out like all the others. They built a mall, and then they built and you can see this is where the wealth is, right? So you see the really high areas, right? So, this is what big shopping malls in the richest part of the county are. And they do really well. This one, Shops at River Crossings, is up here, almost $1 million an acre, as compared to a county average of $77,000. But the hotspot is where? It's right downtown. It's over $1 million an acre. This is in a downtown that's at least 20% vacant. So they haven't even begun to tap this, but you get a higher return there.
I did that math for Anderson. It's the same here.
Yeah.
The Union Building is currently generating more property tax revenue with its current occupancy than most of the surrounding area.
We did a little thing real quick as an add-on to that for the city. Just making space in downtown Anderson, we used the Union Building as a prototypical building. It could handle about 500 employees. If that's all you did, which is not realistic, but you could put 66 more Union buildings in downtown Anderson. If it was all employees, that's 35,000 employees. Vastly underutilized space.
Yeah.
Tons of infrastructure all here that we're gonna go out. And basically who's footing the bill for all the expansion is who already lives here.
Yeah. All right, so what is it that does work? And said, it's about talent attraction, and talent attraction is about creating the place the talent wants to be. This is a Michigan State report. It says fundamentally placemaking is all about creating the types of places that people are drawn to work, play, and live. I mentioned this study that we've done, and so I said we ran numbers also. We took the addresses of the places they were leaving and went and looked at the places they were moving to. And we ran them through WalkScore. People here know what WalkScore is? Website, walkscore.com. You put in any address in America and it gives you a score of 0 to 100. 100 being, you can walk everywhere, 0. And it's walkable in the sense that there are lots of things within walking distance, things to get to.
What are those things that are identified real briefly?
Shopping, schools, parks.
Sidewalks, right, I mean.
Yeah, you have to have the infrastructure, but I will say WalkScore is heavily biased toward the destinations. There are other indexes that try to get more at actual walkability. WalkScore doesn't really do that, so, it has weaknesses. But, it generally is gonna show you, if you've got a walk score of, 60, 70, 80, there's a lot of things within a walkable distance for you to go to, the library, the shops.
Anderson is 55 for downtown.
For downtown, okay.
Overall, it's the city 23, and then when you get out to the suburbs.
There you go. So, when you get down under 60, you gotta drive a lot of places. Below 50 you really have to drive those places. When you get up to, 70, 80, it's pretty walkable. When you get up above 90, they call it walker's paradise. That's the official WalkScore designation. So what we found was that with these companies, their average score before was 52. So, mostly drivable. After it was 88, which is 2 points off walker's paradise. So that's a pretty clear trend where they were going. They also do a transit score, it's a similar move, and of course, more bikeable as well. So, again, that just reinforces what they were looking for.
I'm assuming this contributes to attracting visitors as well, the score.
Yeah.
If I go somewhere, I would really like it to be walkable or bikeable.
Yeah, I mean, on the tourism side, similar thing, right? That's what people are looking for, so. Anyway, there's just a few recent decisions to make the point. Marriott Corporation, which is in Maryland, has been, for a very long time. Now that they were moving, they're in this wonderful suburban campus in one of the richest suburbs, maybe the richest suburb in America, in Montgomery County, Maryland. Not good enough. They want to move. They're moving 5 miles away just to be next to a metro station in the same county they wound up staying, but they had to move the whole thing. ConAgra left Omaha a year and a half ago, is that something like that? Omaha never even got to show them all the tax incentives they wanted to offer them because they just didn't care they were going to Chicago. The irony there is that 20 years earlier, Omaha had to keep ConAgra mowed down a good part of what was a traditional downtown by the river in Omaha. So they took it down to give them a corporate campus, suburban style, in the city. And 20 years later, the tax incentives all that are up, right? They don't even want to be paid to live there anymore. They're gonna go, they wanna live in a real city, so they're moving to Chicago. That's tough if you're in Omaha. Oh, and then of course, Amazon, which clearly was only looking for places that were, highly walkable with transit and so on. It's prime time for 18-hour cities. I like this because when I was in government, we always said we were trying to make a place in 18. We don't need 24 hours. It's not New York. We want to sleep sometime, but 18 hours would be really good. Don't want to be dead in the evening. This is a new development in suburban Fairfax County, and I just thought it was funny that they basically created a walkable place and it was the middle of a suburb. I'm going to show you another picture of it later, but they had this sign, walking is good for you. I just thought it was great. This is part of it still being constructed. This is part of a sign of the times. The amount we are spending to eat at home versus what we spend outside the home. So this over here is on the left is the 1950s, and the purple line is what we spent on food at home. And here's what we spent dining out. And you can see we spent a lot more at home in the 1950s. And these are recessions in here showing. And there it is over time, and look what happened by just about yesterday. We're spending as much out of the house as we're spending in the house. And
do you know what the cost per unit is? What is the gap been from the cost of preparing food at home compared to the cost of providing it, getting it out?
A really good question. I do not know the answer. this is USDA, based on
So
USDA
that might
data,
explain why the gap's narrowed, because it's closer together.
the cost.
Yeah, one time
Yeah.
I produced my own food at home.
Yeah.
I had the cow, I had,
Yeah,
so my cost was very small.
yeah,
Buying out was expensive, and so the relative cost of those have been changing.
yeah. Although, I mean, this is mostly probably suburban people buying, you know, food at the grocery store.
Because of distance.
Well, I think distance is clearly part of it, but I think also households and lifestyles. I mean, this is people feeding a family, multiple kids, right? And so, you know, if you're feeding a family of, you know, 8, like my mother-in-law had to, then clearly you're not going out very much. But as you have smaller and smaller households, the gap between, that's another way it changes, right? I mean, for my wife and I now, the difference between eating out and eating at home is not so much as it was when we had 3 kids at home.
That's my point.
Okay, yeah.
I think the gap is smaller as well, the cost of eating out, and the savings you have by eating at home.
Yeah.
Is not what it once was.
Value
It's
of
probably
time too.
I was gonna say, it is value, time, and effort.
Yep.
I think about that.
And it's lifestyle, you know, I mean, it's all these things, right?
Yeah.
But that's the fact, is that people are looking to eat out a lot more, yeah.
I took my son and wife and their 11 kids out to eat a couple of nights ago at Golden Corral.
Did you get it pre-approved for a loan?
$157.
Well,
It's unbelievable.
I spent more than that for a family of 4, 3 nights ago, so. How am I doing on time?
You're right about, 152. Yeah, you still got 40?
No, I won't take that much. Okay, so, this, realtor that, I heard said, outdoor dining has replaced golf courses, you know, in selling places.
Yeah.
So, I think that speaks for itself. And then we talked about Amazon, so enough said. I like this one just because this was the study that came out. 10 days off 10 prefer live, work, play locations, but NIOP, people here know NIOP? So NIOP is the folks that represent the commercial real estate industry, and it used to stand for the National Association of Industrial and Office Parks. So you can see where they were, right? This is, and a few years ago, they decided they didn't want to be that anymore. But everybody knows, in the industry knows NIOP, so they kept NIOP, but it says, instead of saying National Association of Industrial and Office Parks, it says Commercial Real Estate Development Association. They changed their name, and I think that tells you a whole lot, even more than their study. So a lot of, again, said it's really about creating great places. These are the places we created all over America in the late 20th century, right? These were places of business, right? This is a shopping center. Oh, look, there's a sidewalk. You don't see too many pedestrians. Who would want to be a pedestrian now? I mean, you know, I don't really need to say any more about that. So, you know, what we want is places we want to be. And economic development is increasingly about placemaking. If you know where this is. You guys have been so good at some of them are a good spot someplace not too far from here, stayed away. This is actually Akron, Ohio. Another place that's working on revitalizing its downtown, as you can see. They reclaim sidewalk space, they put in new trees, they put in a protected bike path here and so on. And look, there's people actually there. I said this at the beginning, I'll say it again. The real opportunities are kind of of 2 types, which is revitalizing those legacy main streets that we have that have some, you know, great buildings and great qualities, and we already have some investment in them, and retrofitting suburban centers in a way that creates these qualities in new places. Downtowns, 63% of jobs and materials were within 3 miles of the traditional city center in 1960. I told you by 1970 that had kind of flipped. So by 1996, it was only 16%. But by 2013, it was up to 23%. Again, the direction is changing. We did a study 2 years ago where we basically went to look at folks that were doing what we call the new recipe for economic development, doing it well. And you can get, by the way, and these reports are on our website, you can download a PDF. We picked 6 cities: Boise, Denver, Greenville, Minneapolis, Nashville, and Pittsburgh. They're from large to small.
Where's that picture in the lower right corner?
That is,
Oregon, by any chance?
no, that is, I wanna say,
Boise, that's a state.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, you're
that's
right.
exactly what it is,
So,
Boise.
so Bend, Oregon, which is about the size of Anderson, maybe just a little bit bigger.
Uh-huh.
It's like 70,000 people.
They have something like that, and we go there every year. My family still lives in Oregon, and in their downtown, you'll have people taking a lunch break, putting their wetsuits on.
Yeah, yeah.
And going and kayaking or surfing this area that has like a controlled rapids
East
section.
Race in South Bend.
In Bend.
Yeah.
Bend, Oregon.
And or-
South Bend's doing it too.
Really? South Bend, yeah.
Is there waterway?
They've had
East
that
Race.
since,
So,
for almost
a number of
40
places
years.
are doing this. The first one I knew of was Columbus, Georgia, which again, put a whole controlled thing, it's kind of an amazing effect. And I was in a place in Colorado that's trying to do it too, so, yeah, that's one tactic. You've got, you know, if we got into the what do you do stuff, more detail, it's, you know, work with assets you have. If you got a river, and some places you have a river wasn't doing much, people found a way to make it.
And there were food trucks all over.
Yeah.
Like, it's just littered all the way down.
On a side note, the White River has the cubic feet per second during the month of April, May, and June to have the same swells for Class 4 rapids that South Bend uses in that East Race.
Where is it you're talking about?
Just
Right here.
Just right next to the downtown.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, sorry. Let's see, okay, well, you know, as I said, we featured a bunch of these and showed they're doing, the most, some of the more, you know, extreme examples of success. Denver, which is obviously a big city, has 75,000 people living in downtown. And, you know, it's just a magnet, drawing from both coasts. But then, you know, again, it's not just big place. Anybody ever been to Greenville, South Carolina? I mean, that's extraordinary. This is a town of fewer than 70,000 people. And in 20 years or so, it's just dramatically transformed itself by a combination of things that include some, again, they got water, they made use of it, they got a great park, they put this pedestrian bridge, they took out a highway. Basically, the highway went over the falls. There were waterfalls there. You couldn't see them because the highway was over the thing. It, you know, was a great improvement made in the 60s. And the mayor, very conservative place, Republican mayor, tore down the highway. He told me that, you know, they thought he was crazy. Everybody thought he was crazy until the day they did it. He said they were so nervous because everybody thought you take out this highway, you know, this bridge that goes over right there, and there's just gonna be a traffic nightmare. So, you know, they were up on rooftops around, they had all kinds of people positioned to look and see what happened and, you know, try to make adjustments or whatever, and of course, nothing happened, it was fine. And as soon as they did, everyone was like, oh, there's waterfalls there, you know? And so they did invest in this great park right in the middle of downtown. They've got all this new development, this brand new development right, you know, quarter mile from the main street of the old downtown. And it's an incredibly vibrant place. Sorry? Okay, so again, I mentioned this book. It features a number of places on the suburban side where they're transforming places that, you know, were the traditional suburbs and creating new places that are new centers, which we clearly have to do a lot of because there's not going to be enough of the existing downtowns to accommodate all the demand for that. So I recommend the book. The chapter on Arlington, Virginia. Modesty prevents me from telling you who wrote it, but it's brilliant. And I, you know, just gonna finish by giving a couple of examples just so you get an idea of what we're talking about, what's going on. So this is the first one I know of. In Florida, there was the first one I know of where a mall was converted. So there's a shopping mall in Boca Raton called Meisner Park, and it was dead, so they tore it down and they created this, you know, walkable place with residential a few stories over. Retail, and that's like 20 years now. One of the most dramatic ones was this place in Lakewood, Colorado, which is west of Denver, where they had this million and a half square foot mall called Villa Italia. It was one of the early, in the 1970s, it was like the biggest mall in the country at some point. And it was a quarter of the tax base or something like that, because, you know, it's all residential except for this mall. And the mall was going great, and, you know, like in 1990 it was great, and in 1995 it was dead. So it was like within 5 years, it was, there goes your, you know, quarter of your tax base. So, you know, what do? Well, they decided to create a new downtown. Basically, they put in a street grid and created a place. So if you see it before, this is the mall, and then of course all the acres of parking. And in place now, they put in a street grid and put buildings to the street, and built a traditional downtown.
What's gonna be really interesting about that is to see when all that infrastructure expires at the same time, relative to a more modular, lot by lot approach by utilizing an existing street structure.
Yeah.
35 years from now, when all those routes go bad at the same time.
You will see some of that, I don't wanna take away, but, when Chris had alluded before about the cost, Hamilton County's going through discussions, it's been really prevalent for the last 3 years about they can't build anything that's single-family detached for less than $300,000, because they can't afford the services. So that's real on our neighbor. The one thing that they're already complaining about the tax caps in Hamilton County. That's the richest county we have in the state of Indiana. I will tell you, give them about 30 more years when some of their infrastructure has started to age to 50. They're going to have some similar problems creep up, but the real question is, will they have the tax base or the revenue source to maintain it?
So I think that's a good point. I will point out though that a lot of places we built in the old days too, got built all at one time. And a lot of infrastructure gets put in at one time. And so, there's these cycles to things. And since in the United States, we've never been very good about planning and putting away for that. And so, a lot of the cities have that problem. So the problem by going back to the city is, it's got this infrastructure that all died at a certain time. And part of what contributed to the death of urban centers and the growth of these suburbs was, they got brand new, it's all great, and now the old ones are left having to, deal with the declining infrastructure with the smaller tax base, right? That was a large part of the urban decline of 60s, 70s, 80s. We're now sort of in a reversal in some ways, because those suburbs had exactly that phenomenon, right? So all of a sudden, they have the big bill, and, some of the urban places have gone through a cycle. So that is an issue, but it's a really fundamental issue that we don't plan for and put away enough to maintain and restore our infrastructure over time, generally in this country, I would say. Here's one I showed you a picture of earlier, I think. Yeah, this is the one that had the walking is good for you. So this was actually a drive-in movie theater, because I used to work for the company that had these drive-in theaters in Northern Virginia. And then it became a multiplex cinema surrounded by parking, and then that went out of business. And now and this is in the middle of just classic suburban sprawl. And they created this new thing on about, maybe 30 acres or so, where you have everything. You have people living in apartments, townhouses, stores, a public park where they show movies outside, as you can see here. It's called Mosaic. So here it was in 2002, so this is pretty recent. And this is basically this is the multiplex, and you can see just lots of parking everywhere, right? This is just classic suburban strip. And here it is in 2016, and you can see buildings lining streets. These are new townhouses that went in, so people live here can just walk around the corner and go to the park that's over here. This picture actually, it was, I said 2016, most of this has been built in now, so like some of this here, like there's a building here now. So it's developing into a new town center, essentially, in the suburbs. And then there's one, oops, what happened? Okay, outside of Columbus, Ohio, there's a place called Dublin, you may know that, which was, one of the most successful suburbs in America for attracting corporations and all these headquarters, and they figured out, too, that they were gonna be in some trouble, and they created this area called Bridge Park, which I should have photographs of, but it's an emerging town center that's very popular and doing quite well. So again, another model for a new urban center in a suburban setting. As I said, these things are back. The key is creating places that are attractive, that have a sense of place. This is Asheville, North Carolina. And then in some places where you don't have anything, creative. So work with assets you have in a place like, say, Asheville. But here's, this is Normal, Illinois. Familiar with this? They basically had a big traffic mess here, and they created a roundabout that is multi-purpose, that not only mitigates the traffic most of the time, but is a park. And they got buildings built up to the street around it, and they do activities, and they now have a town center in a place that didn't have one. So, another way of doing this. So again, this is about placemaking, and these are the key things that will make a difference in the 21st century. And with that, I've probably talked enough, so let me stop, say thank you for listening. You haven't answered any questions yet.
Chris, I'm gonna ask you real quick, so, because this is county plan, and when we did our last county plan, one of the things that we heard consistently was that people thought that we should grow around our nodes, which were our cities and towns. And so, we'll see what comes out of this, but kind of bridge that so that everyone here gets that in terms of, do we sprawl, and you kind of got that, and, or do we grow in our nodes?
Yeah, I mean, so the bottom line is that the sprawl is both more expensive to build and maintain and to operate, and it's also not what the market wants. So on both ends, you're getting killed if you keep doing things the way you were doing them. The hard part, of course, is that most of our laws, our institutions, that whole part of the infrastructure, it's rigid, right? We put it in place, it stays that way. And so we have all this stuff, rules and ways of doing things that are fixed and are oriented toward that world. And that's the hardest thing, is getting those things in line with what your actual goals are. You're clearly going to be better off in terms of competing in the market, attracting people, attracting jobs, attracting the companies that want to be here, and in terms of being able to maintain some kind of fiscal stability, if you can steer your growth in a way that concentrates it in nodes of activity, particularly with existing centers, but that minimizes the spread out. Now, it doesn't mean, I was going to say, it's not that no one is ever going to want to live in that house with a 2-car garage, the driveway. Lots of people do, and they will. The good news for them is we built so much of it, there's tons of it out there, and it's going to be cheap for a long time. The problem is we have this real shortage of everything else, and we are not set up generally in most communities in America to facilitate the development of the stuff that the market wants and that will most help the community.
Okay, folks, please ask
Question in
questions.
the back.
I have a question here. So Anderson is maybe not unique, but we're much more an and situation as opposed to an or situation. So all of the.
A what? Say it again?
We're much more of an and situation
And?
as opposed to an or situation.
Okay.
So city versus suburb, we're much more of an and as opposed to an or.
Okay.
So the redevelopment commission has made a huge investment into downtown space over the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months. Last week, we approved $1.5 million in TIF funding for a bus terminal downtown. We bought property on Meridian Street, Main Street, to flip for sort of restaurant, multi-use purpose, all of that good stuff. We consolidated all 4 TIF districts in the city of Anderson into one TIF pot. So now the goal for that is equitable reinvestment and revitalization. That's our goal. However, Anderson for a long time has been included in the Indianapolis-Carmel metropolitan area. And what we hear from businesses who want to relocate here is that they want access to the highway, which is not run concurrently to our downtown. So are there places where that's the situation, where you've got a city that's 35 minutes from a state and regional hub, but they're also their own city who are doing both of these things concurrently well? I'm guessing it would be some sort of more efficient transportation routes that connect those people to where activity is happening, work and play. And then there are people who already live here. So we're not developing a place where there aren't people who exist to get them to come. Sure. We're trying to make the quality of life better for both those who come and those who are here. So are there examples of policy, maybe homeowner protections for people? Because what happens a lot of times when we talk redevelopment is that people get priced out and displaced. And, that's not our goal from the redevelopment commission perspective, for that to happen to people who have been here, who own their home. Maybe it's a family investment. We want it to be a place where those folks still feel like this is their home while welcoming new folks into it. So just some thoughts and questions I had around that. Are there places who are doing sort of the and very well? What does that look like?
So I think what you the last bit you said is a pretty good description of what most places would say. We want to make it a better place for the people who live here. I mean, when I, was in public office, that was my goal first and foremost, was for the folks who were there, we want a better place for us to live. If it's more attractive for other people too, okay. The concern about displacement, that's probably the biggest issue that I work on now around the country, particularly in the places that are really hot. And not enough time to address everything in there, but let me say a couple of things. One, to some degree, that's a reflection of the fact that there is this tremendous imbalance. So we have this shortage of something like, if not everybody, a large number of people want, right? Well, we have an oversupply of something else. And we have on top of that a pretty disparate income distribution now, much more than we had decades ago. So what happens when you have a shortage is the price gets bid up, and the people who get it are the people who have higher income. So that's part of what's driving, particularly in the big cities, you know, the wealthier people are taking downtown, and the, you know, people lower income are being pushed farther and farther out. Repeating the pattern that's actually more traditional in Europe, where, you know, the ghettos are in the suburbs, basically, you know, because that was the pattern of real estate cost all along. We had this flipped around one, and now we're going the other way. And dealing with this is a major challenge. For places in which the market is really hot, where there's really great value being created, the question I think comes down to, how do you harness some of the value that's being created to mitigate the problem? And we haven't done enough of that. In my community, we did have that problem, and so we were finding ways to capture some of the value and then steer that into, for instance, creating more affordable housing. So you can make sure, for instance, where we have big transit systems, so that's the valuable real estate. Well, people with more income need the transit more than anybody does, but they got to be able to live near. So, you know, we worked on policies that would create affordable housing, you know, mixed in around in all these areas.
So did the municipality subsidize that?
Yes.
Because, okay, what happens with developers is they say, I'm gonna make so much profit, I don't have to worry about sort of this low income housing benefit that I'm gonna get or subsidy.
So we did both.
Okay.
So we did requirement on developers for, you know, you're building this new thing,
Right.
there's a certain amount of obligation for affordable housing. And then we give them bonuses, so if you wanna do a little more density, you can do more density, but then we need more affordable housing. And we also subsidized it with our own dollars, with general tax fund. And we created a rolling fund that basically provided financing, kind of the bridge financing for committed affordable units. Again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but you know, you might have something that's supported by low-income tax credit, you might have some bank loan, but you need something to make up the difference.
So effectively zoning that would drive economic regions within your area.
So we didn't do it through zoning because we're not allowed to do that in Virginia.
I see.
But we did it really through, well, you could call it incentive zoning, I suppose, in the sense that if you're allowed to build something and you want to build more, and I was in a place where people wanted to build more, then we can say, fine, you can build more, but you know, you have a right to build this. You want to build this, then there are other conditions applied to it. So we'll give you the rezoning to the, you know, the higher density.
Housing for lower income.
In that particular case, yeah. The truth is, we got a lot of benefits besides that, because there are other things, but housing was the most important one. Anyway, that's one example, but there are communities all around the country struggling with this. So that is a major thing. And you know, again, we can talk a long time about all that. But you had another. I'm going to go back to the part you were talking about in the beginning, which is, well, you know, we have this sort of diverse set of needs and a diverse pattern of development, and we're going to have that in the future, right? And that's clearly true, and it's true for most places in America. We're not going to roll up these suburbs entirely. You know, they're going to be there. People will live there, and there will be people who will want to live there. Hopefully we get to a point where the people who live there are there because that's what they want to live in, and not because it's the only place they can be. There will be businesses that will say, for my business, I need to be near a highway, I need to be around, you know, whatever it is. Because we do some of that still, right? And there's going to be, as I said, there is still manufacturing, and most manufacturing will not be something in downtown. So, you know, there clearly will be those places. The key is to use that land most efficiently, and you know, to at the same time to generate the places where people really want to live. And I think that, you know, while you're going to have some things that are going to be good highway location, highway access is still what works for them. That's not necessarily where the most growth is going to be. Now, again, there are variations across a large and vast country, right? So trends, there can be an overall trend, and some places can be going a little bit differently. And I don't know Anderson, right? So, you know, this is the first time I've ever been here, and I should have said this at the beginning, I usually say at the outset, you're the expert on your community, I can't really tell you about that. Everything I'm talking about is the big, it's the big weather, the stuff that's changing, every place and affecting every place that you gotta deal with. How it actually plays out in your place, it's gonna vary. So you're gonna need a combination of policies, and I think the key thing though is, don't waste the stuff in between. You've got the downtowns, the centers, and you've got the places that you may need traditional, like traditional, 20th century style auto locations. Make the best use of them, but that's not necessarily what our policies have allowed us to do. There's a whole lot of space in between, and we mostly waste the space. And one of the hardest things for people to grasp is how much activity can happen on a small amount of real estate, and that the places we like are actually really small. And in between, that most of that stuff is usually better used for things like farmland and parks than spreading out our economic activity. In a future that's more efficient, we'll have stronger anchors, whether it's downtown or even the highway-based, industrial center or something like that. And in between, we have a less wasteful use of our resources as land. And back.
Yeah, just a question. Do you have any good examples of neighborhood placemaking where we talk a lot about, the central city, the downtowns, the suburban areas, but we have hollowed out, neighborhoods throughout Anderson and other communities are like that. And so it's mostly dominated by rental homes, low-income housing. So there's really not a sense of place, nor are there a lot of amenities that are walkable within those neighborhoods. So there are good examples of communities that have really tried to help with neighborhood revitalization, placemaking, creating a sense of place within a neighborhood, because that's, could be huge in terms of, changing one's lifestyle, a sense of empowerment, view of life.
Yeah, there are a lot of different approaches to that all over the country. We've worked with some communities on things like using the arts, for instance. We have an art program that has done some of that. A lot of our Complete Streets work is, in fact, working at that kind of local neighborhood level for how you can not just spruce up a place, but create a new sense of place and change the relationship between people and their built environment. In my community, I actually this is where I really got started. I was a neighborhood person, and we had a program that was started by people long before me called Neighborhood Conservation, and it was started in part to deal with particularly the kind of neighborhoods you were talking about, and to give them a way to kind of invest in themselves. So the local community would initiate the creation of what's called a neighborhood conservation district, and the county would recognize that district. The community would develop a plan for what they want to do, which would be unique to that community. That we need more street trees here, we need a park enhancement here, or something like that. And we did we float a bond every couple of years, and the dollars from the bond could go to these individual plans. So we were enabling the communities to initiate some of their own, basically, capital investments. That's one approach. Of course, you really have to look at what these places need, right? So in some cases, they may have had, some commercial presence that hasn't been there, or that went away. Like some places would have a corner store, and that was a real center for a neighborhood. It was just a small retail thing, but people would go there, right? And in some cases, we wiped those out. Sometimes we zoned them out because we said no commercial here. You have to look at what they need. Do they have what do they have within walkable distance? What do they have that makes it comfortable for people to be out walking around? Because the thing that makes people feel safest is when there's more people out there. And that's I think this is very much a neighborhood by neighborhood thing, and there is a lot of room for this sort of small scale. There's this talk about tactical urbanism, and a lot of times it gets talked about in the context of that big city downtown, but it's not just that. I mean, a lot of these are small neighborhood projects that can wind up bringing the community together and often leading to permanent enhancements that can really make a difference. And in some sense, a community is a collection of neighborhoods. That was, again, very much the way I looked at my county, which had 60 some odd neighborhoods, because by the time I was on the board, we had the entire county covered in these neighborhood conservation districts, because gradually everybody wanted to get in on it. And I think that was a large part of it. It's not just the stuff we did in the big nodes, the big, high profile things. And I should tell you that Amazon decision, that's my community it's going to. And to a place that I helped replan about 6 years ago, and that's the big thing, right? But just as important to that was decades of working really at the neighborhood level.
Chris?
Yeah,
Well, go ahead.
As we go through this specific purpose, do you have any guidance or priority for us from your experience?
Well, the first thing I'd say is how you do it is as important as what you want to do. And it's real easy for a bunch of smart people to get together in a room like this and come up with really good ideas. And the first thing you got to remember is you're just a bunch of people in a room that, you know, that were ahead of everybody else in thinking about this. You really need to figure out how you're going to engage the public and individual communities and those individual neighborhoods. And that's where it really gets hard. Because if you don't have a lot of engagement, then you're going to come up with a great idea and somebody's not going to like it, and they're going to tell everybody there's a terrible thing, and they're going to say, we didn't have anything to do with this, nobody asked us. And whereas if you can harness all that energy that's out there and get people involved, you will then have advocates for it. You'll still have the naysayers, because you're always going to have them. But it's much more effective when you actually have to go to implement. If you want something done, and you want to actually not just have a plan, but actually build the plan, when you have people in the community who stand up and say, that's our plan, we own that. That's my experience was that's where we had the most success, where we had community buy-in for what we wanted to do. And that's hard. It's scary for a lot of folks, engaging, and because we all know the person that comes to every meeting and has nothing but negative things to say. Every community has that. And we also know the dynamic that can get going when people get scared of change. But if you are able to really engage people, and that means in part, and this is also why it's scary, you have to be able to turn over some of this to them. You have to go in. I always tell people, ask yourself, if you're going to any kind of public community process, are you prepared to accept that what you do in the end is different than what you think you're going to do? Because I've got to figure it out. I know what we need to do, right? I just need to convince all these other people. And the question is, are you willing to go in and say, well, maybe it'll be different after I hear from all of them? And when you can do that, and they have ownership, then I think you have a chance to really do something. So that was a long-winded way of giving you one thing, but I do believe that's the most important thing to start with. When it comes to what you're actually going to do in design, I mean, there's a number of different things, which is things like looking at what your assets are. What is it? What are the strengths? Why was this community here in the first place? There are reasons there's an Anderson here, and what of those? Some of those aren't relevant anymore, but some of them might be. Some of them left behind assets that we don't think about anymore. How do we work to take advantage of those, to leverage them for something new? How do we make this place something that's not just generic like every other place, but has some authenticity, because that's a large part of what people are looking for, both the people who live here and people who might want to relocate here. And you get that when you really look at, well, what do we got here that makes us different? Is it the river? Is it something here we can use better? Is it something historic? Every place has something.
I had a question about, I'm the assistant city engineer, and we deal a lot with stormwater. Obviously, White River is a source, pride and everything, but it's also a floodplain. One of the things, though, that we look at with the new plan, or the comprehensive plan, is the ability to change that infrastructure so it's more amenable and has more capacity in it. And that costs money. Have you seen in other communities, are they just going ahead and fronting the cost? Because I know, like in Evansville, one of the things that they do down there, they're right along the Ohio. They don't have a stormwater utility like we do, but they go ahead and they basically give a credit, or in other words, they pay the developer, go and say, put this amenity in there, and let's fix the problem. Are you seeing more of that kind of solutions in some of these plans in some of these other cities and towns?
Well, you see a lot of different things, and not everything you see is good. So,
right.
I think that if you look at it comprehensively and you come up with a plan, the plan in one level is this end state. Here's where we want to be, and and then there's the hard part of how are we gonna get there, right? And that becomes critical. What are the things that need to happen first? And usually, you know, we tell people a couple things. One is that you need to make something happen in some place. You need to have something catalytic that's gonna work. Like if you're trying to revitalize a downtown, right? That's part of your plan. Well, downtown actually covers a lot of space, and there's a lot of places things could happen. You need enough to happen in one place for it to be a thing, you know, and then it can grow from there. So focus, you know, pick your focal points, and pick them in part on what can be successful early, and that may be, you know, there may be an infrastructure component to something, right? And that's a big thing. I want to start with things that I can leverage, that will early on generate revenue. When I say early on, enough, you know, if I'm gonna have to bond for something, right? I want to know that, you know, within 5 or 10 years I'm seeing something, and over 30 years I can pay for it, you know, whatever it is. And so yes, you do sometimes have to lead with a big capital investment. There's a lot of ways to do that wrong. So, you know, you want to make sure you identify, because when you go through these plans, you probably identify 10 big things that everybody like. And you have to figure out which is the one that's the key to start with that has the payoff. And that's fairly complex.
I have to ask while the rock star is in the room, but as you see downtown redevelopment, often with traffic patterns shifting of moving masses of people through cities, what's the common practice with one-way streets and?
Well, generally speaking, walkable places are not one-way streets. We mostly don't like them. I mean, if they're single lane or something like that, and really tight blocks, you know, Portland does some of this, Portland, Oregon does some of this, it's okay. Generally speaking, you want two-way streets. You want them for a lot of different reasons. One of it is the friction. Is actually, if you're flowing cars, then you're not creating the environment people want to be in, the place people want to be in. And, you know, if you're prioritizing moving cars fast, then you're not going to have a place. It also affects businesses, because if you want retail on either side of a street, let's say, you know, retail doesn't want to be on a one-way street, and there are certain kind of things that simply won't locate there.
People don't live on one-way streets either.
No, they really don't. It's not convenient.
I didn't go that way.
You know?
Exactly.
And the thing is, when you're not going very, you know, in an urban place, and again, urban meaning a town like this, we're not going that far. How much faster can you make it, right? So when you zip the traffic through, who are you helping? Well, you're helping somebody who's going from, you know, Indianapolis to Fort Wayne or something. And you're gonna make it easier for them to run through your town without ever spending $1, right? Why is that in your interest? And yet that cities all across America thought they had to have these highways, and went in for them and basically just sped people through. So no, that's a long way of saying, no, really you want two-way streets. Other question?
In this work, have you seen strategies that work in towns mostly low to moderate income more effectively, or maybe more quickly? We had about a 26% rate of employed people who live in our county that are what we call asset limited, income constricted. And so are there strategies within redevelopment that you've seen in this work that work most effectively for those people?
Well, there are a number of things and there's not a simple answer to that. I mean, number one, I always start with people need housing, so, you know, it's sort of housing first. You have to have a housing strategy. I also want to say that, as with any community, I still say engaging the community, bringing them in so they have ownership in it is true. I don't care what income level we're talking about. It should be the whole community. And that ultimately has a lot to do with something being successful, because usually, otherwise, when we just go in and say we're going to do something for folks, you know, we don't necessarily figure out correctly what it is they actually need. There are, you know, different kinds of approaches. You know, I mentioned the neighborhood conservation thing from my community. There are other programs like that, but it's one I had a lot of experience with. It was originally created for some of the neighborhoods that were poor, and, you know, didn't have a lot of investment, and had a disinvestment in them. It wound up being something that kind of seemed to work for everybody, and it wound up being universal in our county. But it gave them assets. It gave them a way to both come together as a community and say, here's what we really need, and then have access to some capital that would invest in it. Because, you know, for the most part, poor communities aren't gonna have that. So, you know, partly, it's different if you're talking about where an entire municipality is characterized, you know, by low income and low asset, versus if you have a larger community, it's a section of it, because then, you know, you can do something. The question is, what do you do to make sure that the things that improve that community are a benefit to people who actually live there? Which is why I say the housing issue first, because they have to be able to get you to live there to have the benefit of whatever you're doing with them. One of the newest things that's come through that is supposed to help us address this, and I will say right out, we don't know yet, is the opportunity zones. And everybody here know about opportunity zones? So this was in the tax bill from a year ago, and
We're in the running for about 3 tracks.
what's that?
We're in the running for about 3 tracks.
So, so they designate these zones, and this is supposed to facilitate capital coming in. The Treasury hasn't put out the regs yet, so we don't know exactly how the program is really gonna run. And it's one of these things where it might have the potential to really help a lot of places, or it might also have the potential to make things worse. And I'm not sure which way it's gonna go, because it depends entirely on how we administer it. If it's just a tool to, you know, displace people, or if it actually brings capital into areas that need it in a way that benefits the community there. One of the things about the opportunity zones that's why I think it's an interesting potential strategy is it includes not only the places that, you know, are the neediest places, but adjacent areas, right? And you can, so if you're looking for how you're going to, you know, kind of spread prosperity, kind of working from the edges is, you know, one way you can, you know, kind of get it to advance. And this might facilitate that, again, as long as there are enough mechanisms to ensure that the people who live there aren't simply pushed out.
Your navigator on the website for the Opportunity Zone is a great tool. I send it to a lot of people, and Corey, I think it's something you could look at as far as within the adjacent Purdue Polytechnic area, as far as housing, because I think housing will be a big component if real estate investors are able to set up their own LLC for this Opportunity Zone and cash in on that.
I'm glad you find it useful. One of my staff did that. We're looking for ways to expand it now. So also suggest, you know, I'll take suggestions too on ways in which we can enhance it. In the back.
So, you mentioned quite a few times about engaging the public and, you know, making them part of the discussion. Do you have any leading strategies or information, or successful studies of how to engage them in today's times, which is a little more challenging, because people are busy, they're, you know, it's hard to get people to come to a meeting.
Yep, yep. I mean, so there are some things are old things and some are new things, right? Some of the traditional ways are still really important, and of course, there's things like how you use social media now, which particularly in certain parts of the community. Did I mention anything about millennials? You know, you need to figure out how to do that. I'm not necessarily the person to tell you how to do that. But we did make use of them in, you know, in my own experiences, both in county government and, you know, we've done this with Smart Growth America as well. I would say that there are certain basic things, which is if you hold a meeting here, you're not necessarily going to get, you know, the same group as if you find a way to go out there. So almost always, if you need to talk to people in the neighborhood, go to their neighborhood. Find a place, you know, a community center, a gym, some church that'll let you use their basement or something. But it's just amazing what a difference the composition of the room is when you're, you know, within walking distance of their house, or, you know, in the place they consider their place, versus when you say there's a meeting over here in the government center or something like that. So, you know, that's like the old basic stuff. Outreach, you're never done. Whatever you do, somebody's gonna say, I never heard about the meeting. But you really need to, you know, push it out as much as possible. You need to do a lot of these meetings. I mean, I hate to tell you how many we did for some of the more successful things that we had. But it pays over time. It's grueling in some ways. But a lot of it is meeting people where they are, talking to as many people, getting good practices, which this, you know, would take more time to go into, but, you know, good practices for listening. And I usually point people to something that you can find on the web. IP2 is the Institute for there's a spectrum that they have that I really like, that shows different types of engagement depending on kind of what your goal is. It says like, what's the goal of the engagement, and divides it kind of in a sense in the question of what you're asking. So on one end is, our goal is to inform. We're going to tell people, here's what's gonna happen, so they will be informed. That's, you know, they're not being asked their opinion, right? And one over from that is, we kind of know what we're gonna do, but we want feedback. And as you move across the spectrum, you move into the areas of, we wanna work with you to find a solution. You know, where we don't necessarily know what the answer is. We have some ideas, we want your input, and you're gonna contribute to what the outcome is. You know, the very far end of the other end of the spectrum is, we're basically turning it over to you. Now, in practice, we don't usually do that. And in practice, sometimes just inform is the appropriate thing to do. It's an emergency, we need to tell people what's going to happen, and, you know, but there's, most of the hard work is in between here. And the key thing is to figure out beforehand, to ask yourself, what is it I want to get out of, what is the purpose of this participation, this engagement? Why are we doing it? What do I want from the public? Know what it is, and tell them. Because the worst thing is when you go into these and you know, you may have basically made up your mind, and you know, people feel like, oh, you've already made up your mind, right? If you have made up your mind, you need to tell them that. If you haven't, you need to make them believe that you haven't, so that they will actually invest in the effort. And aligning those things, your goals and expectations, with what you're communicating to them, this is what this is about, is the first kind of challenge to making a process that will have credibility over time. Because that's what you need. Because when you're done a year or two later, or whatever, you're going to final adoption in the council, you want lots of people out there saying, yeah, we engaged, we didn't get everything we wanted, but they listened to us on all this stuff, and it's okay. When you're going to implement it, and there's actual projects, and somebody says, what was this all about? You want the neighbors, the community members, the stakeholders to say, you know, we went through this whole project, it's in the plan. So that it doesn't just have to be people who work in government telling people what's, you know, what's good for them.
We're right at just past 12:30, so we can get lunch. I apologize because we've had a good conversation. Chris, I want to give you a good round. Thank you. Applause.
Thank you very much.
So you'll know real quick, just like last time, lunch is served over right where the door is open back there. You can bring it back here. Please continue discussion if you want. Please remember also that we have a public meeting tonight with Paramount, so if you have somebody that you feel should hear this, please ask them to be there tonight from 6:30 to 8:30 at the second floor of the Paramount. We have another meeting tomorrow in regards to community leadership, so if you know somebody in your community that you feel should be at that meeting, those are decision makers, both public and private, nonprofit. And that doesn't mean that if you're not there, that we have a specific reason for each group that we have, and we're trying to broaden our engagement. There will be a minimum of 45 engagements in terms of public participation in meetings in 5 locations throughout this county. We're going to do online surveys. We're going to be doing some other engagement. We're going to be bringing back smart growth. We're going to be bringing other organizations back to this. Our attempt is going to be to, and I'll say it 3 or 4 times, to engage, and we want to hear from you. And Chris alluded to that, because this should be your plan, not ours. We can only give back to you what you give to us. So give us your best effort, and hopefully we'll give you back something when you look at it and go, they gave us back their best effort in return of what they heard from us. So thank you for today. Thank you, Chris. Please have lunch. And last thing, we have scheduled a steering committee for next month. It's close to Christmas. It's December 17th. Do you want to meet on that day, or do you want to wait till January? I'm just asking will you show up if we have a meeting on December 17th? All right, then we will have a meeting on December 17th. That was on your agenda today, and we will see you. That one will be from 10:30 actually from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock, so thank you very much.
And if you haven't signed the sign-in sheet,
Yes.
please do so.
Right here, if you haven't signed, please sign in.
Maybe.
Smells good.
Are you staying or going?
We have all staff today,
Oh,
1:30, so I'm like down and back.
All right.
Oh, I just said through this, very similar with these guys before, yeah. So it's very, I mean,
Feels relevant.
it's very relevant. And it's very complicated. Yeah. Implementing it here, a lot of different.
No doubt.
Even though our boundaries touch, it's totally two different communities. Totally.
Chris, I wanted to thank you. I was out in Arlington a couple of weeks ago, ran the Marine Corps Marathon. Oh, really? And I actually stayed in Crystal City, and I actually got off campus. So I'm very
Yeah.
Then we had, there's like volunteer fire department.
Well, anyway, congratulations on that.
Wow, yeah, I think it's really interesting going and sitting in the city council meetings.
Hopefully it's great.
Watching subsidies for new construction, watching that happen.
Yeah, I know there's politics involved there.
And only incentivizing. You know what I mean? I feel personally, it feels like you gotta make, you gotta draw a line, but obviously that's a controversial thing.
We're right now getting ready to review our whole zoning.
Well, there's other we're excited about whatever we can. So
One of the things we're looking at
Thanks
is
a lot.
that a lot of people like Pendleton because of the downtown area, residential downtown. For the last 20 years, we've not allowed houses to be built on those size lots. It's like, so that's what we like and that's what we want, but we don't allow it. What's going on here? Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, it's interesting too that they focus, I mean, they seem to be really emphasizing a focus on housing, which I think is obviously important. But what we're seeing in our neighborhood is the housing is taking care of itself as far as redevelopment is concerned, as you build a new commercial district.
Well, I think that goes back to one of the very first things is retain the town. You've had a big part of that, the revitalization. You're bringing talent, you're bringing other people in to see what just your bikes out.
Well, we're making sticky spots too, you know, I mean, of our employees at Jackrabbit, half of them, you know, we've got 7 employees, that's not a huge number, but that's 7 people that probably, literally, probably would not live in Anderson anymore.
Exactly.
They would have moved away already if they had not taken that. It's a low wage job, you know what I'm saying? We're not hiring engineers here, we're hiring baristas.
But they're still
But
talented.
they are, and they have other interests, and they're doing other things while they're here. So, yeah, you know, open up a corner store, it's a big deal.
It is a big deal.
Even though it feels like low talent employees, you're providing somebody an opportunity to live in the place that they want to live, you know? We just did 9 days in Portland, and we did some bike school there. And, you know, 35-year-old people, professional adults, working as baristas, working as bartenders, you know, but they make enough in tips that, you know, they're making it happen for themselves. And their career, their job is not their primary focus. They're a barista so that they can paint, or so that they can do whatever it is, they can race bikes, you know, they can do whatever it is that they like. The job is a function of their interests. And occasionally those things begin to overlap, but that's how you build an interesting place.
And the other, I think, thing is a big barrier, and he really didn't say that exactly.
Oh, you're recording our conversation?
Well, it's YouTube live.
Is it really?
Yes.
The,
I'll edit it later.
is the